Hello everyone and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I'm Greg. Today I want to try to do something a little different. I want to compare a book with its film adaptation. Not a page-by-page or shot-by-shot analysis, but kind of a broad strokes look at how the story and its thematic material were adapted for the screen with some positives and negatives. And it feels like a good place for us to start would be If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. First of all, because I read this book last month and I saw the movie 2 days ago, so both of them are fresh in my mind, but also because the movie and the book are actually very similar. The only really big differences are in the handling of a key character and in the ending. So let that serve as a warning. I will be discussing key plot points of If Beale Street Could Talk, and I will be discussing the ending. So if you want to read the book or see the movie before hearing those spoilers, maybe you should do that first, okay? Just to give you a quick plot summary, If Beale Street Could Talk is a love story between Tish and Fonnie. It's also about racial injustice in New York City in the 1970s. It was published in 1974, and that's when the book takes place, the movie as well. Tish and Fonnie have grown up together in Harlem, and they've recently begun an intimate relationship with each other. But even though their relationship is fairly new, because of their history together, they are in love. They're looking at apartments together on the Lower East Side so they can move in together and start a family, but things aren't going well. They're having trouble with landlords, and it ends up with Fonnie getting arrested after a false rape accusation. Tish is also pregnant with his baby. She tells him that she's pregnant in the opening of the book and in the movie as well. So Tish is pregnant and trying to get Fonnie out of prison. She's trying to work the racist system in New York City and the corrupt police department and an indifferent legal system with the help of her family. And that is If Beale Street Could Talk. Like I said, the book and the movie are very similar. Most of the differences seem to be places where things were taken out of the book for time purposes in the movie. You do see a very different stylistic approach right off the bat because director Barry Jenkins opens the movie with a quote from James Baldwin about Beale Street in New Orleans being a vibrant center of African American life in this country, and art and community and family. And he talks about how every city in America has its own version of a Beale Street. And that is not actually a quote from the book, not even in the foreword. So right away you can see that Barry Jenkins, although he's not directly giving you the answer about what the title means, he is pointing you in the right direction. Jenkins also opens and closes the movie with photographs of police either arresting or inflicting violence upon black men during the time that it's set. Basically, Jenkins is specifically pointing out that although this is a fictional story, the type of story that he's telling has happened all too often in real life. James Baldwin assumes that his audience will have familiarity with that urgency behind the story. That's not a knock on either Barry Jenkins or James Baldwin. It's just a very different approach to how the audience receives and takes in the material. Anyway, like I said, most of the differences appear to be where things that are in the book were cut out of the movie for time to keep things streamlined and moving along. And for instance, both the book and the movie open with Tish telling Fonnie that she is pregnant while he's in jail. In the book, she goes home knowing that she needs to tell her mother that she's pregnant because she's terrified to tell the rest of her family, and she figures if she tells her mother first, it'll make things easier. The mother is played by Regina King in the movie. The mother's name is Sharon. It's a really sweet, tender moment in the book, and it's a great introduction to Sharon and the relationship that she has with her daughter. And since so much of the book is about relationships, it really sets the tone for the whole thing. In the movie, she goes home, her mother comes home, and she tells her mother, I need to tell you something. And then it cuts away to later that night when they're about to tell the whole family. And I can see why they did this because basically it prevents the movie from having to have 4 successive scenes of Tish announcing her pregnancy, because after they tell the family, they call Fonnie's family over so they can tell them the good news. I just loved that moment as an introduction to Sharon, so I missed it. There are plenty of moments throughout the rest of the book and the movie where you do get that sense of that really nice bond between the mother and the daughter, Sharon and Tish. I just happened to have really liked that one. And if I hadn't read the book before I saw the movie, I wouldn't have even known that it was supposed to be there. But having read the book, even though it's brief, that was one of my favorite moments, so I really missed it. What the movie has that the book does not is a scene that really exemplifies the father-daughter relationship between Tish and her father. In the book, you know that he loves her and will do anything for her because his words and actions bear that out. He gets Fonnie's father together and they start stealing from their employers in order to pay the legal expenses. But that's how it shows in the book. The movie gives you a more explicit scene where it's late in the movie. Tish is very pregnant. Fonny's not pregnant. She's feeling sick all the time. She's in pain all the time. And things aren't going well with getting Fonny released from prison, so she's despairing. So she's at home and she's throwing up in the bathroom, and she emerges into the kitchen and finds that her father has made her tea, and he has her sit down next to her and rest her head on his shoulder, and he whispers comforting things to her. And it's this remarkably sweet, tender moment that is not in the book. So kudos to the movie for adding that, because it adds a whole nother layer to the theme of relationships that is not in the book. Another thing that was probably cut for time is Fonny's family. In the book and the movie, Fonny's father, Frank, shows up a lot. But in the movie, his mother and sisters only show up for one scene. They show up to find out about the pregnancy, react to it, and then they disappear. And in the book, even though they're not around a whole lot, they have a sort of spectral presence, because the book does go back into Fonny's childhood and his relationship with his mother and his sisters and the family dynamic, and it shows you how that turned Fonny into the man that he is in the present. And that's all missing from the movie. Again, if I hadn't read the book, I wouldn't have even known that it was missing, but there was something really interesting about that, especially since Fonny's mother is very religious, deeply religious, and having the added details about her show ways in which her religion can be hypocritical and her attitude toward things is hypocritical. There's also a much more complex relationship between Frank and his daughters in the book, because his daughters are actually around in the book, than what you see in the movie. In the movie, you only see them as agents of their mother. But in the book, at least one of them, Adrian, has a much more complicated relationship where she loves her father, but she doesn't feel connected to him. She doesn't feel that he loves her because she reminds him of the mother. Later on, as both the book and the movie progress, it becomes essential for someone to go to Puerto Rico to track down Victoria, who is the woman who accused Fonny of rape. She has fled to Puerto Rico with the assistance of the police department, who are getting her out of the country. And the movie doesn't explain why Sharon, Tish's mother, has to be the one to go on the journey, but the book does. And again, if I hadn't read the book, I probably wouldn't have even noticed it, but it felt urgent because the movie also doesn't tell you that Sharon doesn't speak Spanish and Sharon can't drive. So in going on this trip, she is literally someone who can't swim and is out in the middle of the ocean. And that lends a real urgency to Sharon's trip in the book. It makes it feel suspenseful, and you don't know what's going to happen. And it shows the outlandish depths that she's going to in order to help her daughter. And none of that is in the movie, because in the movie they just kind of tell you, oh, Sharon has to go to Puerto Rico, and she goes. And now we start getting into the really big differences, because Sharon's trip to Puerto Rico brings us to Victoria, who is, again, ostensibly the reason that Fonny is in prison. The book and the movie make it very clear that she was, in fact, raped, but she was manipulated by the police department into identifying Fonny, even though she hadn't seen who the attacker was. And now they've paid her off and gotten her out of the country. And her Victoria identifying Fonny in a police lineup is the most damning piece of evidence against him. So Sharon is going because they want to see if they can convince her to recant her testimony. Now, it's not that the book does not have sympathy for her. I think James Baldwin does go out of his way to show that she has been traumatized by what happened to her. But the book does treat her much more like an obstacle that needs to be overcome. She's something that the characters need to deal with in order to get what they want. And the movie does that as well, but the movie is much more careful to extend empathy toward Victoria. I saw an interview with Barry Jenkins where he said he talked to the female cast members to ask them how they should handle it. And unanimously they said, we need to acknowledge what happened to her, or else we can't do this. And that's what the movie does. They are much more sympathetic toward what happened to her. They still kind of treat her like an obstacle because they need her to recant her testimony. But there's much more understanding. There's a much larger, more concerted effort to say, I know you're in pain, but we're in pain too. Given that more modern understanding of what Victoria was going through as a victim of sexual assault and the ways in which the Time's Up movement undoubtedly shaped the script, Sharon's meeting with Victoria happens under very different circumstances in the book and in the movie. In the book, Sharon attempts to have a man that knows Victoria in Puerto Rico arrange a meeting. She finds him in a club and talks to him and gives him a photo saying, please, I know this man. He didn't do it. Look at him. He refuses. He will not set up the meeting. He doesn't want to put Victoria through any more pain. So Sharon has to track down where Victoria lives and get there herself. and she goes into Victoria's apartment in order to confront her. The movie simplifies all of that by having the man just agree to arrange a meeting, and Victoria consents to that meeting in a neutral location, which is a courtyard outside of her apartment building. So in the book, Sharon is essentially forcing herself on Victoria, going so far as to penetrate her safe place, her home. And in the movie, Sharon is not an aggressor. It's a neutral field with consent, and I hate using words like penetrate and consent in a certain way, but I think those connotations of those words are exactly why they handled the meeting in a different way in the movie. And that's where the differences between the book and the movie really start to speed up. At the end of that meeting, Victoria violently breaks down in the book. And she does in the movie, but it's not a violent, horrific scene of her breaking down in the movie like it is in the book. And we find out that Victoria loses her baby and her mind in the book, which of course means she can't travel back to the United States to testify, and Fonny's trial is postponed. Things look bleaker than ever for Fonny because of this, because if he ever had a chance of winning over the jury's sympathy, it's gone now because the accuser has lost her baby. We don't see the outcome of the trial in the book, but we do see Fonny harden himself to the reality that prison life is going to be his life from now on. This is not just a temporary thing. He will not be there when his baby is born. And that hardening is really difficult to read in the book because it shows a lot of the hard life that Fonny is going to be facing. It reveals that he ends up in solitary confinement for refusing to be raped. He is beaten very badly and almost loses an eye. And knowing Fonny is the happy, upbeat, trying to remain optimistic man throughout the whole book, it's very difficult. It's a really bleak ending, and it gets even bleaker because the book ends with Tish finding out that Fonny's father, Frank, has committed suicide. Basically, Frank was caught stealing from his employer in order to pay Fonny's legal expenses, so he was fired. And on top of that, he feels like a failure because he was unable to keep his son out of prison. So the suicide is how the book ends. It's really bleak. Now, in comparison, in the movie, Victoria does disappear. Fonny's trial is postponed, and Fonny does appear to accept that this is going to be his life, but it's done in a much more artistic, romantic way. We don't get the hard look that the book takes at what his life in prison is going to be like. We then see Tish give birth to her baby, and we flash forward 5 years, so we see Tish and her 5-year-old son visiting Fonny in prison. We hear that he accepted a plea deal because it was his best option after what happened with Victoria. And while it's not perfect, we do see that Tish and Fonny are trying their best to make their family work in the conditions that they are forced to live in. There is no suicide in the movie as well. If there is, it happens off screen and is never mentioned. So even though the movie then pivots back to those photographs of police abusing black men or arresting black men that we had in the beginning, it feels like a much more romantic, hopeful ending than the brutal punch that you get from the book. So, which one is better? I say the book. I think a lot of the deeper details James Baldwin give add a lot to the story, and I think the more somber tone and the bleak ending feel more on point and thematically appropriate. Although I do recommend that you do both. The movie is really well done, beautifully filmed, and the cast is fantastic. But if you're going to do both, I would actually say watch the movie first and then read the book. Because, like I said, I read the book first, and when I went in, I was looking for all the details that I loved about the book, and they weren't there, and that bothered me. So I think if you watch the movie and then go to the book, it's like discovering a bunch of bonus material. And that experience would be much better than the other way around. Anyway, that's it for today. I'll be back with other movies and book comparisons, but I don't know what movie I'm going to do or when I'll be doing it. So if you have recommendations, please leave a comment and let me know. And be sure to subscribe if you want to see that when it comes up. Until then, happy reading. Thanks for watching this video today. If you liked what you saw, subscribe, watch another video, leave me a comment. I love recommendations for one thing. Tell me some things that you'd like to see, and I will be back. Thanks.